The final step before we can use this data table is if we create a function library. So a function library is simply just as the name says, a library, and inside of it is functions. So let's just right click here again, make a new folder, and let me call it libraries. And let's change the color of it. And inside of this folder, let's right click, go to blueprints, and use this one called a blueprint function library. So you can see we've already used the blueprint class. Now we're using the blueprint library. We've used the blueprint interface. So the macro library is just like the function library. We've used the enumeration, and we've also used the structure. So you can see we've actually gone through most of these blueprint classes. So really nice that you got through all of this and you're getting the experience. So let's create a blueprint function library, and let me call it BP function library because I only have one in my game. And let's open up this function library. So inside of a function library, you can make functions and you can make them here. And the good thing about a function library is that you can use the functions globally. So if I make a function here, let me just call it, for example, haha random. And if I compile, now if I go to my player blueprint, for example, and I right click and say random, aha, or aha random, that's what I called it, you can see I can now see functions from a function library. And it doesn't matter where I write this. If I open up the game mode and I write, haha, let me get out of this one actually, let me get to the event graph and say haha random, you can see I can see the function inside of the function library. So whatever function you make inside of here can be seen globally through all of the blueprints. And so just keep in mind, don't just spam functions inside of here for no reason because it takes up performance if this library is huge. So the only thing you should use it for is if you have a function that is used in many blueprints. For example, you're getting the weapon info, you might use that in the player base, you might use that in the game mode, you might use that in the player controller. So if you have a function that you are going to use across multiple blueprints, then go ahead and make it inside of a function library so you don't have to make the same function again and again in each blueprint. But specific functions, don't create them inside of a function library. This is only meant for functions that you are going to be using a lot of times across blueprints. So for example, for this one, we're going to call it f get weapon info. And so we're getting the weapons information. And I'm also going to tick pure, and pure just makes it that green function. So if I compile, and you can see if I go to the player base, for example, and say f get weapon info, you can see it got green. And the reason it got green is because I clicked on pure, and here you can see it. So it actually gets like those green functions if we have created one. So this one, for example, for this one, we're getting the controller. You can see it is green because it's simply getting information. If you set information, then you need these pins here and they are blue. So these are set functions and these are get functions. They're simply getting information without modifying anything. So this is what we want to do. We want to get our weapon info. So we set it to pure because we're not modifying anything. And inside of here, the main function that we need to use inside of here, if you right click, it is get data table row. So this one down here, get data table row. This is the main function that we need to use. And we need to select our data table. So we need to get information from DT weapon info. And now you have to tell it what information do you want to get from it. Now this needs to be dynamic depending on what you're doing inside of the game. So let's just make it and I can explain it later. So for the weapon info now, let's create a variable and let's call it weapon name. And I'm going to make it into a string. Now I'm going to take this and say replace and use this function called replace. Now the reason I use this is if you inside of your data table here, let's say you have a name, for example, let's say you have a weapon called M41A. Let's just pretend that this is a weapon, and you have spaces between your name for the ID Now, when you create something inside of a data table, it actually removes the spaces. So if you open up the data table, and let's say you imported this one in for space 1a. If you imported that into here, it would actually remove the space and it would just write in for 1a without a space. So what I do usually here to remove all the spaces from here when you upload them, I take the weapon name, and here in the from, I press space. So make sure to add one space, and the two can just be empty, nothing inside of here. And that is it. So what this is simply doing is it's taking all the spaces from these names. So let's say it's this one, it's taking the space and it's replacing it with nothing, meaning that you're actually deleting the space like this. And then it will find the correct ID inside of this data table, because this data table automatically removes these spaces when you import them. So when you search for a name without, like with this space, it will give you an error. So we're removing all the spaces, and now we're going to plug that into here. It's automatically going to convert the string into a name variable. And then we can drag from here and say return. And you can connect this output into the return, and you can call this one weapon info. Okay, so now we are finished, and I need to explain the whole process to you because this might be a bit confusing. So what we're doing here now is we can now say, for example, here inside of the player base, we can say get weapon info, and we can call that function we made in the functions library. So we're getting that weapon info. Now we need to plug in a weapon name. And let's say, for example, we're going to do that in the next lesson, but let's say, for example, I plugged in the name AK-47. Okay, so it's going to take that name. It's going to go inside of this function, so into the function library. It's going to take the name here, going to remove all spaces if there are any, and it's going to put that AK-47 that I wrote here into the row name, which means it looks here in the row name. It looks for the AK-47, so it looks for this one. Now it knows we are talking about this row. So now it knows the name, the type, the class, and so on. So you can drag from here and say break. You can break structures. And now you can see all the variables. So since it takes the information from this data table, now it knows now it knows the name of the AK-47. It knows what type of weapon it is, what class it is, because it's taking all of that information from this data table. So that's how you use it. And now we need to actually make those weapon names. So let's delete this for now. Let's compile and save, and let us move on.